Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Fake Accents Unite. I am Mark, I'm not so obvious, and I'm joined today by our new guest, Captain Switzerland. Say hi.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
That's very good. And the Britisher, although the Britisher is delayed somewhat, no doubt, by his kettle. So we will be joined by him a little later, hopefully within 10 minutes. But I didn't want to delay you any longer. And just welcome everybody. There's been a lot of talk about Brexit in the chat that I can see before we went live. Something which I was discussing just a moment with Mr. Switzerland just a moment ago, and then I decided this was much better topic to have on stream where you can all listen to us and all input as well. So we were talking about the fact that I was a Remainer, and I have swung to the Leave side in the wake of the vote, knowing that democracy has to be upheld, and that I was a Remain and reformer. But now that we're coming out, I've simply decided, and in hindsight, with Articles 11 and 13 coming out now, and copyright law, etc., across the EU, I am kind of glad that we have moved towards the Leave side. How about you, Switz?
Well, I was, for the longest time, I thought I would be a Remainer were any referendums come up. And then shortly before the vote took place, as we were previously saying, because of the awful quality of debate that we had around it, I had to go find it out for myself, and I switched over to Leave. On the point you make about the copyright laws, though, I do certainly think that could perhaps grab the attention of people who still aren't entirely behind Brexit now, going, oh, well, this is something that will, a bullet that we'll be lucky to dodge, seeing as we're on our way out now.
Good evening, Britisher.
Good evening. How are we all today?
Good evening.
We are good. We have started about 30 seconds ago without you, I'm afraid. I couldn't keep the audience waiting. They were clamoring at the gates.
Well, I mean, if the audience is clamoring.
How are you today? Good.
Oh, I'm hanging on in there, trying not to melt. I think that seems to be one of the chief goals at the moment here in Britain.
Yes, indeed. I'm sitting here going, I've gone out and I've walked the dog about 7 o'clock in the evening, and I'm just going, oh, he's just baking. I don't know how our people on the in the Mediterranean and Africa deal with it all the time.
Well, I mean, as far as the weather is concerned, I think Brexit is now completely okay because we've got the continental weather now. We can leave.
We've taken the best bits of Europe and we're bringing them with us to the new Britain. Then,
so effectively, we can kind of teach the Welsh to speak French, and the Scots to speak Spanish, and the Cornish can take up bullfighting or something like that. And we.
Although, have we decided then that we're going to move Britain? So in the wake of when a hard Brexit happens properly, the English Channel will swell to about 3 or 4 times its size, and we'll end up down in the tropics.
You do realise that we'll basically we'll end up in some graveyard behind the church, at sunset, just over what hard Brexit actually is to mean.
Oh, probably.
Because
it's just so
these definitions are kind of flying about, and yet they mean something different to every single individual.
Yes, indeed. Like, I've heard hard Brexit be described as a no-deal Brexit. I've also had it be described as sort of
not a soft Brexit.
Yes, not a soft Brexit. The kind without tea and biscuits at the meetings. The kind where you have coffee, perhaps to aid negotiations.
Yeah, which it's such a difficult conundrum, isn't it? Because strictly speaking, is a hard Brexit what people would refer to as a meaningful Brexit, or is it actually beyond that?
I'd describe a hard Brexit as a meaningful Brexit. I feel that hard Brexit is a label that's been attributed over the last few years, but what a hard Brexit's supposed to entail, I thought that was just Brexit. I don't know where red, white and blue Brexit comes into this, by the way.
Well, there is such a thing, is there? There is a red, white and blue Brexit.
Is that the one where we secede to America?
Is there a black and blue Brexit? As in you kind of been beaten black and blue.
Yes.
Is that where the negotiations take a bit of a violent turn, and we see Michel Barnier and David Davis tussling outside Brussels?
Yeah, they turn into cage fighters. Yes.
I don't know what it is about the word Brexit in particular, but it reminds me of breakfast. Right. So whenever I hear the word Brexit, I think of the program that I would run if I was to run, daily politics, but on Brexit. Right.
So you would do the full English Brexit.
Full English Brexit, basically. And I can imagine that it would be breakfast and Brexit, and that would fade in over a waving English flag while someone butters toast in the background.
Well, yes, but I could already see Alec Salmon and Nicola Sturgeon writing in angry letters.
No, I don't want any salmon or sturgeon on my breakfast. It's just. I
mean, since we're talking Brexit and we're talking things European and whatever, I do need to ask about the origin of the Captain Swiss badge, because the Swiss have turned somewhat Eurosceptic too over the years. So, does that kind of play into that, or was this just something completely chosen at random?
It might as well be something chosen at random. It's pretty much unrelated to any of my politics. It's more down to when I was at university, I was known among friends for being a bit of a diplomat, shall we say.
So it's the diplomatic side, it's the neutrality.
That's the one.
Okay, I was about to inquire about, yodeling and lederhosen, or...
No, I've got nothing to offer on that front, I'm afraid. But I get asked that all the time, and I understand it's probably the most confusing thing that I have the name Captain Switzerland, yet I am nothing to do with Switzerland.
I mean, that's actually quite befitting, because the Swiss are quite a confusing people. Well, I mean, they've got, what is it? They've got 5 official languages. They've got 4 languages they actually speak, and then they've got Latin as their 5th official language. That's just so they can put Latin on the stamps and, the money and the cars and whatever, without anybody accusing the others of being favoured.
What country was it we were talking about that doesn't or didn't have a name until recently?
Macedonia.
Macedonia, that was right.
They were the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia.
Yes.
And now they've become Northern Macedonia, which effectively means they have to, in their own name, acknowledge that there is such a thing as a Southern Macedonia.
Indeed, indeed. Before we go any further, I have received a rather interesting piece of information from our old friend, the academic agent.
Oh, here we go.
So you recall a couple of fake accents ago where you took a political compass test, Britisher.
Oh, yes.
And you came out...
No doubt I'm about to be told I'm a communist by the academic agent.
Oh, no. Well, he apart from the fact that you're barely tolerable to him, because he released a graph basically saying you're on the side that builds the helicopters, but only just on the board, just off the boarding side.
I saw that, yes, and I was just trying to recall, does that actually mean I'm a helicopter builder? But apparently, yes, I am.
Apparently.
So, I wonder what part of the helicopter I would be in charge of. Something tells me I wouldn't be the one who builds the doors that can be opened, or the trap door in the floor, or whatever.
The trap door, you're assuming they will have a floor at all, and they don't just hang off of...
Well, yes, but the evil henchmen that push them would have to have somewhere to stand, wouldn't they?
Yes. So here, if you look on the Hangout, you'll find the academic agent's political compass test.
Crikey!
Yes, he's close to the edge, isn't he? There.
I know. What I love is that he's not even. He will push on about how liberal he is, and yet you'll notice that on the liberal spectrum, he's actually not that far off the dead center.
Yes. Yeah, I'm beginning to understand why the academic agent argues so fervently that the Nazis were actually socialists.
Indeed. And I was planning on because I'm quite disappointed you didn't bring it up. So he got very stressed today and decided he would take this political compass test because everyone was doing it. Because I revealed to him your score. Sargon has obviously done a political compass test today. And in fact, loads of his guests have now done one. So he figured he may as well do one of his own.
So am I wishy-washier than Sargon?
Sargon is left of you by about 2 blocks, but that's it.
Okay. So I'm wishy-washier than Sargon insofar as that I'm more centrist even than that.
Oh no, he's the same amount of centrist, just on the other side.
Sargon places in the bottom left green square, doesn't he?
Oh, I'm with you now. Okay.
Yes, only
Only just.
I believe he's taken. I can't see his score right now, but
But
for
I think
those,
it's fair to say that Sargon and myself, we would effectively be still in support of the NHS, whereas the academic agent would just basically take a flamethrower to it,
basically,
while the
yeah.
patients are still in it.
So here's the actual description of the political compass test that a academic agent uses. And obviously, he's going to be one of the builders. Apparently,
Well, I just notice one thing that says everything, and that is that it says who gets thrown from the helicopters. It says who is boarding the helicopters, who pilots the helicopters, and who builds the helicopters. But the academic agent, being the wishy-washy soul that he is, it doesn't say who owns the helicopters.
Well, that'll be if you're in the dead center. Dead center, they're the ones who own the helicopters.
Well, in his mind, the person who owns the helicopters is probably not on this graph. It's probably somewhere to the right of it. But I love the fact that he places himself in the builds the helicopters square.
Or it turns into a three-dimensional graph. And who owns the helicopter is the one who hovers above the entire square.
Who's the puppet? Who's the puppet master? But he's in the build square, which means that he truly is a friend to the working man.
Yeah, he's the one in charge of building the doors. Yes, I'm just the one that screws on the rotor blades or something like that.
He will whistle while he works. Yes.
Don't tell him, Pike.
But yes, have you all done the 8 values test? Says New Left Voice.
Given that I do not know what it is, no, I haven't.
I am vaguely aware of its existence, but I can't say I've taken one.
I've actually taken the test, but it was over a year ago, so I couldn't really tell you what results I got. But it's
either that or all your 8 values have changed that much in the last 12 months.
Perhaps, yeah, perhaps. I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum now, and I dare not admit it.
Perhaps fodder for the next fake accents. Although, if this is going to just become a test-taking stream, then I don't think the audience is going to be retained for very long.
Yes, I think you might have a point there.
I may do. So the first thing I wanted to talk about this evening is this. Bear with. Screen share. Where's it gone? There we are. Present to everyone. I still haven't worked out how to do audio, but we can do it. This is from Kent Online, news you can trust, which means you know you can trust it.
It's always a good sign when they tell you can trust it, isn't it?
Yes. Have you seen the film Zulu, Britisher?
I have a film review on my channel in which I say what for a glorious film the movie Zulu is. Yes.
Shameless plug, shameless plug. If you haven't seen it, go watch it after the stream. But basically, this says calls to axe racist Zulu film from Folkestone's silver screen cinema listings. I will point out that Sargon of Akkad has co-opted me here and stolen this article from me and used it for a video of his own, which was released earlier today. But I want to say I had hold of this article first, damn it. So we're going to talk about it anyway. It says here, campaigners are calling for a charity showing of epic war film Zulu to be axed over claims it contains racist overtones. The 1964 classic will be aired at Folkestone's Silver Screen Cinema on Saturday to raise aid for the armed forces charity SAFA, who do a lot of good work with particularly injured personnel. But a whole 28 people came out and protested this film, which apparently is there. But this article is very much on the woke side, I think. So it leans into the fact that charity helps improve the lives of military veterans, etc., and the funds. But it says the choice of the film Zulu, with its inaccurate portrayal of historical events and distortions and racist overtones, could have a negative effect on relationships within the changing and richly diverse communities here in Folkestone, which obviously contains a nearly 90% majority population of Zulus.
Of course.
That we live in.
We live in Zululand. That's the main thing. I mean, I think it takes a certain level of cognitive dissonance to lump all black people in with Zulus, which is clearly what's happening here.
Well, they're obviously all one and the same thing.
Yes, indeed.
Whoever is complaining, to those people, they all look the same to them.
Yes, very sad, really. No power of discrimination.
Yes, there's no difference as such between Nigerians and Kenyans and Ethiopians. They're one and the same thing.
Indeed. No, I don't know why I'm agreeing with you here. You're saying is racist. Shut up. Minus 10 points for racism. British, behave.
Well, I am merely trying to reflect the attitude of the people who are actually complaining about this movie.
Mm.
Because believe me, my hair stood on end when I saw this. I indeed intend to put this up on my weekly roundup. Because
on the week that was.
Yes, because this one really gets my goat.
Indeed. I love the fact that they get it for factual inaccuracies as well. And you just think most films have what's called artistic license.
Yes, I mean, I think it's just basically they heard there were some factual inaccuracies, so they immediately jumped on that bus. Whether that actually has got anything to do with the supposedly alleged racism is neither here nor there. So the fact that they weren't actually Welsh soldiers,
yes,
you know, that's a factual inaccuracy, but that has got nothing to do with the racism which they allege.
Indeed, not to mention the fact that these are the same people who are arguing that Thomas Jefferson was black.
You what?
Have you not seen this? I believe I say
Jefferson was black.
I say these people, but like these kinds of people who are moaning about factual inaccuracies, where you're looking at it and you're going, they also will be historical revisionists who believe that a black man invented the light bulb or something like that. Which I showed. Didn't I show you the other time? Like black inventions or something it was.
Well, I mean, there's an endless thing, that basically one tries to claim anything one can. I mean, that's the same like what is it? The we was Kangs trying to claim that all the Egyptian pharaohs were black and so on.
Oh, I've seen something like that. I don't know whether there was a Louis Theroux documentary or something where he went to meet a group of people somewhere in the States and they were pointing out all these different historical figures, whether they were classical composers or, like you say, Egyptians or whatever, and they went, no, black man, that was a black man. He was an upstanding black man.
Oh yes, and then they said being black isn't part of it isn't based on your color. If you can trace your heritage to more than a certain number of black ancestors, you can be considered black in their ethnostate, which they wanted to bring about by the year 2000, which is going quite well for them.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, it's about as far advanced as Richard Spencer's ethnostate.
Yes. You laugh, Dominic, but they did say, I believe, that Beethoven or Bach or Mozart was black.
Well, of course, they would have to be black because they were good at music. And
yes,
if white people can't dance, we can't move, we have no rhythm,
we can't jump.
We've all heard these things, but those things are not racial stereotypes whatsoever.
No, of course not. That you can't push a racial stereotype if you're oppressed. It's just not possible. Yes, or if you're acting on the behalf of someone who's oppressed, no matter if they don't think they're oppressed.
Yeah, it's a kind of painful, painful kind of lesson to listen to these people when they go on about the ancient Egyptians and whatever, because particularly recently, I think they had a bit of a comeuppance because there was some DNA study done. I think they managed to extract some DNA from some pharaoh's mummies or something like that. Yes. And they found out that the DNA seemed to kind of point to something of Cappadocian heritage, which of course would kind of fit because I believe they intermarried with the Hittites.
Mm.
So it kind of suggests that they were more of sort of Middle Eastern / Turkish origins.
Yes.
And therefore had very little to do with the kind of Nubian blacks of the South Sudan.
As Harry Engledive says, don't forget that the first Briton was black. This is Cheddar Man, is it?
Oh, well, yes, but I think that was debunked as soon as it was
I do believe I
Yeah,
do
go on.
also believe that I don't care, and most Britons, because we live in a relatively aracial society, you know, compared to America and that sort of thing. Like most people just really don't give a damn. Really, we couldn't care less, or we couldn't care less.
Well, it's interesting because it is perfectly true what you say there. Because I had sort of, among the various Twitter confrontations I've just had these last few days, you know, somebody basically let me know that it was all our fault, you know, for slavery in America.
Right.
And when I
The
kind of
ones
tried
who
to,
abolished slavery
yeah, when I
itself.
kind of tried to point out, well, you do realize that we are actually kind of the prime force against slavery in human history. Oh, well, what about India then? And I just went, well, what about India? Oh, so you mean to say you're claiming to know your history and you don't know about the British involvement in history in India? And I went, well, not in terms of slavery, no.
You
After
wait.
which it suddenly went very quiet, and I never heard from that person again.
You need to wait 100 years, and then people will talk about British involvement in upskirting.
Oh yes, yes, yeah, yeah. The
For those who didn't
the
watch,
worst crime known to man. Yes.
for those who didn't watch our last stream, the British government decided it would find the time to prosecute, to debate a member's bill that would criminalize upskirting as a separate offence and put you on the sexual offenders register
Yes,
for it.
Would be a sexual offence.
But they didn't have the time to debate Brexit, but they had time to debate that, and they had time to debate what was it? No, I'm thinking of something else. But basically nonsense.
You know, they find endless amounts of time to talk about absolute twaddle. That there's no other way of putting it. And not only to debate it on the House, I mean, that is the most precious time as such, but they waste that. But also when you look at the amount of you know, interviews and whatever they've been giving on this particular issue, you just think, I'm sorry, but these are grown-ups.
Yes.
You know, I know one talks of the silly season. You know, once one hits summer, usually politically, it's a bit of a dry vein. So what one does, one finds all sorts of, you know, surfing dogs and whatever to report on the news. That's a well-known fact. But this could hardly be the case today. You know, when you look at the political scene at the moment, I mean, you know, when it comes to political news, it's bursting at the seams. And yet we get upskirting and other nonsense.
Yes.
Or, you know, what is it? Jess Phillips recently revived her "I was threatened with rape 600 times in one night" claim.
That was the one.
And you went, hang on a moment, this is 2 years old. And
yes.
it was believed to be nonsense 2 years ago. And then she starts talking about it, and she's in every single mainstream newspaper and news outlet.
And they treat it as fact when it was never substantiated. Yes.
As far as this upskirting goes, though, prior to this hitting the news, I'd just kind of assumed already that it was an offence. I'd assumed that
it is illegal. Yes, but they would make it. It falls under a broad category of sexual.
I think it's something like outraging public decency. That's what it would fall under.
And it has appropriate that sort of thing. But the idea that it would be its own separate offence, that it would carry a statutory penalty of 2 years in prison and your name on the sexual offenders register alongside actual rapists, where you're going, it's cost £70,000 to imprison you, conservative estimate.
This is the same country that hasn't found any evidence of grooming gangs in London.
Yes.
But which is going to be a sexual, you know, because, I mean, they are going to make it a sexual offence. I mean, Theresa May has gone out of her way to say she will not be foiled. She will not allow this private member's bill to be brushed aside like this. It's a feminist issue. It's important to women, blah, 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 blah. We will make time for this and we will pass it. So it will be passed. It will be a sexual offence. People will people will be under the threat of going to prison for up to 2 years for this.
Yes.
So this will become real.
which is very sad, really, considering that sitting over there on the table is a lovely Brexit sandwich that needs to be eaten.
Well, yes, but as I say, if it comes to sexual offences, we know that there wasn't really that great a concern about upskirting. There was a campaign by one young lady to whom it had happened, but as such, there was no great awareness of it. So there cannot have been any great concern about it.
If we manage to print up a Brexit deal, and then we have it printed out and we stick it under someone's skirt, will the government finally take notice?
Apparently, yes. I think that might be a good way of going about it.
I have to get the female members of the Liberalists UK to volunteer.
Is that where this white paper's been hiding then?
It's the white paper. Tighty white paper, yes. Goodness. Yes. Anyway, where were we? Zulu. It goes, yes. Basically, here's the film Zulu should be shown. Glad to see that the membership is on the side of, funnily enough, actually showing a film. But the where has it gone?
Well, clearly a biased poll. All racists.
All racists. Yes,
yeah,
every
16,000.
They make
if you conduct a poll like that among the members of the EDL, I mean, what do you expect?
I mean, look at this man. He's clearly Hitler. He clearly wants the oppression of all minorities.
Well, I mean, everything about him says completely unreasonable.
Indeed. The Battle of Rorke's Drift was in reality little more than a footnote. It doesn't matter. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's a footnote or not. That's what the film is about. It's like, it was a grandstand, that sort of thing. There was a far more important and far more gory battle earlier in the day, 11 miles away.
Yes,
you can pronounce
those
that.
150 men who were fighting off 4,000 Zulus.
Yes.
They weren't really very concerned at the time
that there was
whether there was a bigger battle somewhere else,
no,
or whether, a long time later, we would still be talking about it.
Yes.
They were basically having to face ridiculous odds and work out how to survive that matter. That's really what they were concerned about.
I mean, there's a reason.
It still is a fantastic story.
It is. I mean, this is why you get fiction like 300 and that sort of thing as well.
Well,
because
that's racist too, of course.
Well, of course it is. But
the Iranians complained about that because it was anti-Persian.
I think it's this one thing about the British as well, like the underdogs. You have to. We're very pro underdog in the country.
Well, we can actually be remarkably pro underdog. Have you ever seen the film The One That Got Away?
I have not.
That's a black and white movie with Hardy Kruger in it. And he plays I believe he was a German aircraft pilot who gets captured by the British.
Oh, I believe I've got it upstairs on DVD.
He actually manages to break out, and then he gets back to Germany, or back to Europe effectively, the long way round. So I think he actually goes to Canada and whatever, and from there then manages to get back across the Atlantic towards the somehow towards some territory from which he's able to join the Germans. And that's a British film.
Amazing.
So the British were quite willing to basically take their hat off even to a German who did something remarkable.
Well, we're quite, compared to the Americans, so when it comes to World War II, we're the only nation who buried our enemies' war dead when we did that. So when we won. The Americans had their great graveyard, but we buried...
We were also extremely admiring towards Rommel and people like that.
Yes.
But I think in that respect, we are, how shall we say, we are the nation you would like to have as the referees in any sports contest. Because...
the Switzerland of the sports contest.
Oh, well, yes, there is, of course, the Swiss. But don't start me on the Swiss and sports contests, given the way they've been behaving at the World Cup. But no, for example, if you take the movie Master and Commander.
Yes.
A lot of Americans will immediately a wonderful film, brilliant. Actually, there's a little detail that was changed. It was Patrick O'Brien's novel.
Yes.
In the novel, the enemy ship was, dare I say it, an American ship. So it was the British Navy fighting an American ship. But that was conveniently changed to be a French ship, because apparently you can't sell a movie if the Americans are the bad guys. And I think that's where some of the Americans ought to ask themselves, why is that?
Yes, I do think so.
I think as far as the Americans go, the bad guys for them are usually either the Russians or a nice, smooth-talking British person, aren't they?
Well, either someone with a British accent or someone with a German accent. Those seem to be the two accents that scare them most.
It's Ben Kingsley or Hans.
I mean, Germans, Nazis, they do make the best stock villains. I almost feel that World War II was just precipitating people being able to use Nazis as characters in video games and films for the next few decades.
Well, they do have they are the best dressed.
Wasn't there that wonderful little sketch? I think it was Smith and Jones. I could be wrong. It could also be the Not the 9 o'clock News or something like that. I think it might have been Smith and Jones, where you've got this kind of room full of Nazi generals, and they're kind of having a conversation, you know, an abortive conversation with each other, in which each one of the generals always introduces himself as the type of general he is. You know, I am the German general who has a limp and a twitch in his left cheek. You know, and he goes on each single stereotype of a German Nazi general, you know, or each one with a monocle or something like that.
Oh, I am the German general with the eye patch. That's
yes, precisely.
I am evil enemy bad guy.
Eventually, the one who's late comes in. Oh, guten Abend, meine Herren. I am the German general with the eye patch. No, that's me. You know, so he desperately is looking for his little niche and can't find it because it's already taken up by somebody else.
I'd like to I'd like to point out to the two of you that by mimicking the German accent there, you are actually committing cultural appropriation.
Nein, das tut man nicht. Denn wenn man Deutsch sprechen kann, dann ist das keine kulturelle Oh God, was ist Appropriation? Oh, I can't even say that in German. I'm sorry.
I can't say it's an appropriate use of.
Yeah, but it's not cultural appropriation if you can actually speak German.
I thought this was
the fact that you can speak
the appropriation in German.
The fact that you can speak German at all definitely means that you're culturally appropriating something based on your parentage.
I thought that this was Fake Accents Unite, though. Surely, if anywhere we're allowed to do fake German accents, it would be on this stream.
Until we get shut down by the fake accents bill, that will be no doubt debated when Brexit needs to be pushed back a little bit further.
The ultimate program for fake accents, and it gave them sleepless nights, was in fact "Hello, hello."
Oh, yes.
Because that is one of the most brilliant uses of fake accents anybody has ever encountered. But at the time when they were writing it, and when effectively the BBC gave the go-ahead and they kind of went into production with it, nobody had any idea whether it would work. Just to anybody in the audience, the entire secret of the sitcom Hello, Hello was that it was set in France under occupation by the Nazis. So all the people, of course, had to speak English because otherwise the audience wouldn't understand them. But the way it was basically decided, as in who was on whose side, was they either affected a German accent, a French accent, or an extremely English accent in order to sound stupidly British. And at the time, they had no idea whether they could actually pull it off. So they went into production not knowing whether this would actually work. And then I think it became the best exporting comedy that the British have ever had. It went round the world. It was a smash hit. But I could well imagine that quite a few of sort of the translators will have had a lot of fun. If you put this into other languages, just exactly how do you pull that off?
Cameron Hickman says English is the bastard child of Old French and West German.
There is some truth in that, but there are plenty of other languages thrown in, such as Scandinavian. We have got quite a bit of Viking in there, and I think also a bit of Latin.
bit of that cultural flavouring, a little bit of seasoning on the top.
And yeah, well, in on top of that, we've kind of borrowed a few words like bungalow and pajama from completely different parts of the world.
Yes, you don't really think about where these sort of everyday words necessarily come from on a regular basis. But of course, trust you to know where they do come from, Britisher.
I believe it was George W. Bush who once said that the French have no word for restaurant.
Well, no, I think he was actually more specific. He spoke about the French not having a word for entrepreneurism.
Oh, was that?
Yes, that was the one.
That was the one.
And yes, I think quite a few American citizens just wanted the ground to open up and swallow them at that particular moment.
But then the ego caught them and guided them back up, so it's fine.
I think they had to suffer through that a few times during that presidency.
Oh, I mean, he surely was just about one of the dumbest people ever to have been let near power.
Yes, I don't know quite how he managed it, but
I mean, Blair got things wrong simply because he was villainous, whereas Bush at the time, I think it was just plain stupidity.
Yes, he wasn't the smartest
and the
man.
fact that he was supported by a lot of people on the religious right who thought he was ordained by God didn't really help.
No, I can imagine not. Maybe that. Let me see. One of the protest group for the Zulu film contacted organisers Bigger Boat Pictures in hope that it would cancel the 7 p.m. showing, which is going there. And I believe this is quite funny. Like, organizer said, "Come and see the rare screening, and make up your own mind as to whether or not this is a timeless tale of courage, honor, and pride, or a product of yesteryear that has no currency and should be banned." So he was using it to market his own film, which is quite entertaining.
Well, what I would have done if I would have been in his shoes is I would have cancelled the film.
Would you?
And instead, I would have put on another film, The Dam Busters. And I would have turned up the sound every time they call for the dog.
Goodness me. Of course you would, because you're such a contrarian Britisher. You're basically a Nazi yourself.
Well, yes, of course, but I just thought that would have really helped rub it in, as in, if you ask us to cancel the movie, we will, but we will put something on that will offend you even more. So stop complaining, you stupid little children.
Yes, one of the people said, it's just a film with a poetic license. I've seen it many times. I don't see the color of people's skin. I see a war between two countries, which is very true. And actually exposes. I thought that's a good response, to be perfectly honest.
Well, what gets my goat about this, because I think you realise that this somehow has got under my skin a bit, this particular story, is that this and other stories of this kind seem to be kind of, whether they are unwitting attempts or conscious attempts at kind of undermining our own culture. Basically telling us that things that are sort of cultural markers of ours, things that are important to us, are all to be abandoned.
Yes, well, they want to erase our own history.
Yes. I mean, we're told that we should tear down Nelson because he supported slavery. We're now told that Zulu is racist. All these things that kind of are part of the kind of fabric that kind of make up our culture. And I know these are just one or two single things, but we know that this is an attack that is happening on a broad scale across the board.
Yes, again and again. It keeps consistently coming up.
You just kind of feel, there is no pleasing these people. And if you give them what they want, you will end up with kind of no cultural markers, no identity to speak of for the nation in which you supposedly live.
Well, that's kind of what they want. But then they want to expand everything to a sort of a very globalized society where there are no borders and there are no nations, just groups of communities, which bizarrely is just what nations are.
Really true, because yes, they want to. They clearly are intent on somehow, undermining certain cultures, which they would kind of see as the white predominant cultures, which predominate for a reason. I mean, we have created the richest cultures. And I'm not talking in terms of monetary wealth. I'm talking in just sheer depths of layers.
Yes.
But aside from that, they are very, very keen to constantly promote some indigenous culture there or some immigrant culture here. And
yes, ignoring the fact that we have a culture all of our own here.
Those people's identities. But when it comes to these predominant identities in our countries, we're somehow told that everything to do with these identities, everything to do with these cultures, is just a remnant of colonialism and slavery and oppression. You can throw in patriarchy for that, for good measure. And it's really, it's increasingly getting my goat. Maybe it is because I'm just getting somewhat of an overdose of constantly seeing this with making these YouTube clips. Who knows?
But I do find I have to take small breaks.
Yes, sometimes you just need to switch it off, just move away from it and turn the television on and watch something completely different, because at times it has got the capacity to just drive you insane.
It does. It does, particularly when you look at it and they go, well, this culture is underrepresented in this country. And it's like, well, we're a melting pot. The idea is that we have an amalgam culture which takes the best bits. Like, that was one of the greatest strengths, I think, of particularly post-50s Britain. And you get people come in all the time. The Poles come across. You have the obviously the Indian community, the Asian communities, and whilst they keep to themselves, for the most part, I believe I keep thinking of this quote, and I do not know who said it, where he basically said, I lived next to all these different next to Kurds, next to Gurkhas, in fact, next to blacks and browns and yellows and all sorts. It's an old quote. But one thing, we were all different creeds and different colors, but the one thing that bound us together was we were all English.
Yeah.
And you just go, yeah, well, that's something which is missing now in the rhetoric of, shall we say, the higher ups, in that we're not encouraging people to integrate into being English, and bring the best parts of your.
This ties into what what was touched upon just before, when I kind of gave the reaction towards the Swiss, because I don't know if you heard what has happened at the World Cup with 2 Swiss players.
No, please to enlighten us.
Some hand gestures or something, weren't there?
Hand gestures, exactly. So, the Albanian flag is kind of that double-headed eagle, isn't it? I think a black one on red background. And of course, Kosovo is largely inhabited by Albanians, ethnic Albanians, and they broke away from Yugoslav rule, or from Serb rule, at one point, and there was quite a bit of fighting. I think the Allies bombed Serbia once more, and so on. But apparently there are 2 players on the Swiss team who are ethnic Albanians, basically Kosovo Albanians. So chances are they were refugees, their parents were refugees during the fighting. They therefore grew up in Switzerland with Swiss passports and now play for Switzerland. Well, so far so good. Except, of course, they were playing Serbia.
Right.
So when they scored, they kind of intermeshed their hands with their fingers splayed out to kind of give the impression of kind of eagle wings on their chest.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, for one, that was clearly a provocation towards the Serbs. Which obviously didn't go down well with FIFA.
No.
But I think the question beyond that is, look, what's your nationality supposed to be? Now you're playing for the Swiss team. And here you are making nationalistic symbols for another country. So you clearly seem to feel some sort of allegiance towards that country. So what exactly are you doing in Switzerland then? In rich, comfortable Switzerland? Do you understand what I mean? And you sort of feel, well, I'm sorry, but please decide what your allegiance is and then live accordingly.
I think part of the problem is that, as far as I understand it, politics is best kept out of football anyway. I think that you know,
agreed.
to try.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'd only heard about this, just the hand gestures being made, and obviously the fact that it got FIFA's back up and the Serbian side as well.
But this is just it. I think that in a way it should get the Swiss their backs up too. Now, obviously, they are being much too opportunistic because they don't want to lose two of their best players. But you know, if I were in charge of that team, I would be tempted to do what the Spaniards did with their coach at the beginning of the tournament and just fire them. Because I'm sorry, but you know, you are effectively making kind of patriotic, nationalistic hand gestures of a different country, and you're playing for us. Do you understand what I mean? To me, that's just
not on.
It just doesn't. It just doesn't fit.
So I'm interested though that kind of your take on this. What kind of annoys you the most about it? It's not necessarily what they did that it would, you know, be seen to annoy the Serbians, but it's actually the Swiss that you're concerned about. You kind of think, oh, they shouldn't be playing on that team if they're going to go riling nationalist sentiment up for another country. Then,
yes,
that's kind of your approach.
Well, because I think we have got a certain. You see, we've got this thing. I don't know if you caught this. It was on recently on the BBC where they were talking about you know, who feels British and who feels English in this country and whatever. And the amount of responses they got of people who clearly were, you know, either immigrants themselves or descendant of immigrants, who just said, "Oh, it's just a passport," and you just feel, no, it isn't. I'm sorry, it is not just a passport. Would you say that of the country your parents came from or whatever? That, oh, well, Pakistan is just a passport. No, you wouldn't. You would then say, oh, no, it's a culture. There's you know, a great many aspects that make up that nationality. And yet they're kind of just seeing it as a flag of convenience. And I think that is a massive problem to us. That if we have got a growing immigrant population of this kind, well, fine. But nonetheless, they have to kind of realize that, look, if they are supposed to be on this team, if they want this team's passport and they want all the privilege kept in about that.
There's a question I've spotted that's been asked in the chat a couple of times, where people are saying, "What do you think? What is British culture, or what would you define British culture as being, as being something distinct to, say, you know, French culture or Serbian culture or whatever?"
Well, you have a look at things like, so if you think about what you would associate with French culture, right? So it's the Renaissance, it's the French Revolution, it's cheese and wine and that sort of thing, right? Those are sort of staple aspects. It's the if you're talking about the south of France, it's the Mediterranean diet. If you're talking about the middle of France, it's the Alps, that sort of thing. So when it comes to Britain, what you're talking about there is what British traditions make up the British culture, which Britisher will know much more about than I will, probably.
Well, I mean, I think it's quite simple. You kind of, you've already touched upon it. You know, things like food. You know, and I know we are not famous for food, but there is actually some food that's quite decent that we produce. Then, you know, you've got things like, you know, what we would regard as cultural aspects. Music. I mean, I think we would have a shake or two at music when it comes to it, you know, given our output of the last 100 years.
Yep, certainly.
You know, any kind of visual arts. I mean, it's not as if we haven't sort of created our own film industry and whatever. But, you know, in a way, that's kind of the high end. But, you know, look at our sort of high streets. You know, look at the pubs where you've got, you know, the King's Head pub and things like that we kind of take completely for granted. Well, go look through, you know, the streets of Munich in Germany and try and find a pub that is kind of wood-lined inside. And you know, I'm sorry, there are certain aspects of our sort of way of life that is completely and utterly unique. Again, you can walk around the continent and look for brick-built terrace housing, which here particularly in England, but also Wales, Scotland, not so much, but still to a certain extent, you can find kilometres and kilometres of, to use the European measurement. Whereas over in France, how many terrace houses would you find? So we've even got a different architecture. You know, the entire, everything feels different. When you go from distinctly different nation to nation, you feel it in the air almost. France feels different from Spain, from Italy, from Germany.
I recall when I was traveling from Italy to Poland, getting off the plane and instantly feeling a different atmosphere.
Yes.
I mean, utterly different, much more relaxed, but and not. It wasn't just it was colder. Because it was still a high level of energy, but it was a much more relaxed atmosphere. Everything felt more open. In Britain, we have this sort of, you know, this idea that we live in a relatively safe society. We walk around, it's free. Like you have people who, you know, it's quite friendly, but like it's a lot of nuance to British culture. So like you can expect that attendants at say a supermarket will talk to you in a certain way, but not in that sort of very faux advertising way that American supermarket attendants do with a plastered smile on your face.
Even that
Oh, yeah.
being under attack. You know,
yes.
So I remember sort of reading an article once where people in shop workers or whatever in Newcastle had been told not to refer to people as pet.
Oh yes, I recall.
And you just go, I'm sorry, but that's just part of the cultural flavour of the language of that part of the world.
Yes, in the same way we have love down here.
Precisely. And if you just basically intervene in that and just basically say you can't do that anymore, you just go, well, I'm sorry, but you're changing the nature of the people. You're deliberately intervening there.
There's another one, actually. I think it was last year. It was announced on the London Underground. They'd no longer be referring to people as ladies and gentlemen. They'd say everyone for the sake of it being more inclusive. And I thought, well, look,
gentlemen is pretty inclusive, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it covers pretty much 99.999% of anyone who's going to be out and about that day.
In my mind, aside from children, it covers everyone. Because the literature, the academic literature and the scientific consensus does not support something like the idea of dozens and dozens and dozens of self-identities. And certainly biologically, you only have ladies and gentlemen. So in that respect, you are playing into what is currently described as, now it may change over time, but I don't believe it will, playing into what is effectively a delusion.
Yeah.
But I would say though that biology aside, let's take into account people who would self-identify as another gender. I'd still expect that does make up a minuscule proportion of the total number. In
the vast majority of the trans lobby don't care about they want to identify as the other one. They don't want a whole new category made for them, and they only make up 3% of people are gay, and something like 0.3% of people are trans, and of the 0.3% of people who are trans, some of those self-identify as something else, but
And for that purpose, change it from ladies and gentlemen to everyone, which, like, to even have a gripe with it in itself feels petty, but at the same time, it feels petty for them to change it in the first place.
It seems like a waste of time.
Yeah, this is one of the things that you come up against time and time again in any kind of political discussion, and that is, why are you against this? Why are you so petty to be opposed to this? And
does it really affect you?
One always tries to play this game of basically saying, you're the one, you are the one who has got some kind of objection and whatever. And you kind of always have to point out to these people, no, you are the one who wants to change something. I am merely the one who is asking you why you want to change this. And I'm opposed to changing it just for some silly reason. But
Yes.
it is still you who has to provide a reason. The onus is still on you. You are the one who is petty in wanting something changed due to some minuscule, tiny little reason. It is not us who are petty, who basically don't understand why we should change, an unknown
Peoplekind.
number of aspects to our way of life.
Shall we, but you can imagine these people looking and going, we should change all of the pronouns in every single piece of literature that gets printed.
Yes.
So that it's only X, Y, and Z. And you just go,
go back through the works of Shakespeare to make it more all-inclusive by getting rid of the male and female pronouns.
You see this when you let's ban A Clockwork Orange, and that sort of thing, because it has a bad language in it. And you go, well, bad language, like the reason that language is coarse is because some people come from coarse areas. And you're talking about a period of history that was somewhat coarse in and of itself. So you can understand why people, there is a legitimate, we live in such relative decadence now, shall we say, and comfort compared to, dock workers in the 40s, where you're going, most of them can't read, most of them can't write. They spend all their days hauling things because the shipment container hasn't been invented yet. And, and they use rough language. That's just the way it is. And you go, well, that if in a novelization of that period of time, or even if, I don't even care if it's fictional or not, or if that kind of society, that kind of thing will creep in. And believe it or not, there is legitimate cause to use bad language as well at times.
You can just see something going wrong on those docks and some heavy box ending up on someone's big toe. And he's taking a step aside and saying, oh, my dear, that is a tad unfortunate. and you just think, well, yeah, that really wouldn't really work in a book, would it?
You can imagine him screaming at the top of his lungs, marvelous day, isn't it?
I find it interesting. One of you just brought up the example of Clockwork Orange. And I think shortly after that film came out, it was banned for some time, wasn't it? It took a while for it to receive a rating or to be released. There was something along those lines to do with Clockwork Orange I was aware of, that it had been banned in some form for an amount of time after it was out.
I think Kubrick himself withdrew it. Because I think he was getting such stick that he effectively said, okay, well, all right then. So effectively the distributor almost pulled it.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yes.
But this was the interesting point I was going to make, that if we were to go back, 40 or 50 years, you'd have things that were seen as being obscene or offensive being banned for, a certain set of reasons.
Well, you have a look. Sorry, just to interject.
Go on.
You have a look at something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which has no on-screen deaths, I believe, which was a film which defied classification for nearly 20 years.
Well, it was one of the famous video nasties. In the 1980s, this term came up, video nasties. Invented largely by the British tabloids. I think the Daily Mail more than likely was once again the market leader in this field. All the people who quite like the Daily Mail these days because it's nice and right-wing and it bashes the SJWs should remember this. And basically the government was sort of bounced into passing some knee-jerk law, a bit like upskirting, which effectively created almost like a blacklist, and it was referred to as the video nasties list. And anything that was on that list just basically was banned from even being looked at by the BBFC.
I think that feeds into the point I was going to make, though, which is it's interesting to me that years back there was one set of reasons why things would be banned, and that would have come, like you said, it was from the Daily Mail. I kind of saw it from coming from an air of some kind of a conservatism, without trying to dabble over what the exact ideology is. But nowadays, I think it's coming from the opposite end. It seems to be coming from the left, largely. This idea of censorship of, I mean, we don't exactly have video nasties nowadays, but I'm sure there's some.
Never forget, never underestimate the ability of censors to find reasons to ban things. So, you would think certain output would just be absolutely clear, that would be free for distribution without any questions. But when you hear that John Wayne films have now been instructed to, to include cuts in order to allow them to have kind of family-friendly certificates. You kind of realize that what they've done is, with them realizing that society has become more permissive towards bad language or perhaps permissive is perhaps the wrong word. Society was always permissive in that regard, but it can't be hoodwinked to that extent anymore. So now they've just found different reasons to ban things. So several John Wayne films were subjected to bans for animal cruelty, would you believe?
Oh, for goodness.
So I would assume it's more than likely falls of horses when someone gets shot, in the cavalry charge, or possibly even branding of cattle.
Grief. It's like you want to... I find it funny how, like, a lot of material for children at the moment, and I know this because I have young cousins who I look after relatively frequently. A lot of that has things like overzealous parents in it, taking children to like cotton wool land or pillow factory or something, where they immediately wrap the child in bubble wrap and too many cushions to the point where they can't move.
Yep.
And that's anyway, the whole thing portrays this as a massive net negative because you can't explore, you can't learn.
Have we lost you? No.
Uh-oh.
I think something has just befallen, not so obvious. So I think we'll just continue and see whether he can fix his technical problems and be back with us.
Yeah, I think the bubble wrap might have got him.
Yes, precisely. I think his parents have just pounced. But no, when we were talking, before about the Zulu thing, the point I would like to make in that regard is there are certain stories that are kind of important to the national psyche. And you will find kind of myths and legends within every society. Have we found you again?
Am I back?
Yes. Back. Okay. Thanks. Thank
I
you
get
for joining.
in the center of my anecdote, and then I get this. Have we lost you? Sort of side of things. I'm going, good grief. No, you haven't. No, I was saying when you have a child wrapped in bubble wrap, and the whole onus of the episode is them escaping the bubble wrap zone and going on an adventure or something to that degree. Anyway, I must have seen 2 or 3 different programs do this, but it's amazing that that's the sort of thing we teach children is wrong. And then apparently, as soon as we move into our 20s and 30s, it immediately becomes right again. And we must be revisionist, and there was no animal cruelty in history, and the parts of it that included it must be removed. There was no slavery in history, but we must remove that, but massively highlight it for the time being so we can get reparations first.
Yes, and the Romans were all terribly multiracial.
Oh yes.
Have you seen that? You must have seen that cartoon clip.
Oh, probably. The thing about the Romans actually that amuses me is that they were all about the average height of a Roman was 5'5".
Oh yeah, I could well imagine. Yes.
Which I can imagine. So you can imagine the Roman legions coming to you.
Well, the funniest thing I think you have to consider about the Roman legions is, of course, I mean, we're not sure about their tunics. I personally, I suspect their tunics would more than likely have been red, but their cloaks were definitely red. But you have to understand that this will have been the days when dyes weren't all they were made up to be.
No.
So consider for a moment, the Roman army being on campaign, say, in a bright, sunny place like Spain or Greece.
Yes, bleaching the tunics.
Yeah, so after a while, you would have tens of thousands of men walking about in pink, wouldn't you? Suddenly doesn't quite make them so frightful to our mind anymore, does it?
It doesn't, but I suppose when there's 30,000 of them in front of you.
Yes, yeah, I know where you're going here, but
what was it?
If a person's wearing a pink T-shirt but they're holding a spear in their hand, I'm probably still going to be afraid of them.
I did see a funny thing talking about what would happen if the Roman legions were in Lord of the Rings, and of course they brought up is it Hannibal? And his conquest where he brought the elephants.
Yeah, the Carthaginians. Yes.
That's right. And so you're going, if you're talking about the Romans fighting monsters from another world that they've never seen before, they already have done that when the elephants came for them.
Well, the Hannibal didn't really have that many elephants. Most of them died on the way over the Alps.
Oh, yes, but still,
he had some elephants, I think, for the first 1 or 2 battles, and
yes,
then after that, everything was actually done on foot.
Yes, mainly because the Romans developed anti-elephant strategies, which took them out very quickly.
They had already developed them against Pyrrhus of Epirus. That was the first time they ever came up against elephants.
Well, fine. I was just referencing that they had come up against elephants and not seen them before. The
poor sods who ever first came up against elephants, that was the army of Alexander the Great.
Mm.
And they came up against Indian war elephants, and then just, I mean, you can imagine if you're from somewhere from Macedonia and then suddenly an elephant comes your way, it would more than likely be a bit of a shock.
Just a little bit.
But sort of with the empire of Alexander kind of falling apart and falling to all his generals, they then obviously knew of the war elephants, so they merrily started importing war elephants from India. So like that, they spread across the ancient world.
How interesting!
But one of the scariest introductions of war elephants must surely have been here in Britain. When Claudius invaded Britain, in order to make absolutely sure that he would win,
he brought
some war elephants.
Goodness me.
So try and imagine the ancient Britons
marching down the road to London as the elephants come for you.
I mean, we were not used to mammals that large. We might have had a few foxes maybe or something.
And you could well imagine that might have had a slight psychological impact.
I'm trying to think, because I was to reference the stoicism of the Romans. I can't remember what it was their worst battle. Or worst war, where they lost something stupid, like on the worst day or something, they were losing.
Well, they lost some really heavy. The art of the Romans wasn't that they just won every battle.
No,
they did lose, but they always bounced back.
Yes, and they kept going. They refused to capitulate.
Precisely. Against Hannibal, they lost very badly. The Battle of Cannae or Cannae, whichever way you wish to pronounce it, that was the real hammer blow, where he annihilated an army of theirs. You see, the kind of heavyweight, the heavy infantry of the Roman legion is often referred to as the meat grinder. That it will always find a way through. So even if you defeat the army, the meat grinder will always find a way out and kind of get to safety.
Well, I remember...
But at Cannae, there was no way out for the meat grinder. They butchered them.
60,000, wasn't it?
Something like that, yes.
Something like that. 50,000 killed, and then a great many taken prisoner.
Well, I don't think that won't have been Cannae. There was another terrible defeat that the Romans suffered in what the Germans called the Teutoburger Wald, where they were kind of lured into a trap. They kind of fought in ridiculous terrain. The terrain most unsuitable to the Romans. I mean, if you think, where do you want to have a legion? You want it in an open, flat field when it can maneuver.
Yes.
So what do? You find some sort of craggy terrain which is covered in forest, and then you ambush them. And that's how the Germans defeated, several legions, plus, of course, all their auxiliary units that were with them. So, it was tens of thousands again. And there, some of them may have been taken prisoner or whatever. But at Cannae, apparently, there were no prisoners. It was just butchery. And it must have taken them about a day to kill them all. So they managed to surround them, and then they had to work their way inwards, if you know what I mean.
One of the, and this is going to be a bit of a weird tangent, but I visited Auschwitz last year, and they were talking about the fact that when the killing machine that they had wasn't particularly efficient because they had to get rid of the bodies, and it took a long while. And they would kill them in groups of sort of 200 to 300. But you go, how long would it take to clear a field of 50 to 60,000 men? Or do you just leave them there? Good grief!
Oh, you would just walk away. I mean, you would strip them of anything that was valuable, and then you would walk away. You'd more than likely, you maybe would bury, or you wouldn't bury, but you might cremate or bury your own.
Yes, or at
But
least
it would more than likely just be too much work to do everyone else also.
Indeed.
That is, unless, I mean, there were some famous battles, at the gates of cities, and you could perhaps imagine that it would be at least unhygienic to leave them all out there, if you know what I mean, once you were finished.
Grief.
But no, while you were off, I went off on a little tangent that I'm just trying to complete. When it comes to Zulu and whatever, you are looking at stories that kind of make up some of the, some of the base identity of some places, because every country has its own myths and legends. So, in Germany, you start with the Nibelungs and things like that, or in in Scandinavia, you've got the Norse gods.
Yes.
Here in Britain, you've got King Arthur and Robin Hood, and you've got all sorts of tales, and of course, every age brings forth more tales that then get passed on. And in a way, all these stories eventually amount to something, and they amount to being part of the identity. They're not necessarily that historic. Robin Hood is not verbatim taken from history.
No, it's hardly the
there is
the
some
pinnacle
sort
of the Magna
kernel
Carta.
of truth. There is some sort of kernel of truth in there. We know there was more than likely some Robin or some Robert Hood, and then a lot of other things are kind of added on that were actually different people.
I definitely need.
You end up with something that kind of is part of the stories that people tell each other in that particular part of the world. And in that respect, Zulu is one of those stories. And it is one of our stories.
You'd say it's sort of part of the cultural fabric then?
Yes,
that's sort of...
very much so.
I definitely need to walk away and watch Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves after this. But go on.
Oh yeah.
I would very much agree. Not the Prince of Thieves. I would go with the Errol Flynn version.
Oh, but I do love Alan Rickman. Anyway, go on. Sorry, Captain Smith.
Oh, that's fine. I was going to say, as far as Zulu goes, I've neither seen the film, nor am I amazingly well versed on the battle either, to be quite honest with you. So I can't speak from a personal position in saying it means a great deal to me in terms of cultural heritage. But as far as the campaign for it to be blocked from being shown goes, I think, well, look, if there's a bunch of people who want to get together and stick on an old war movie for charity, who's anyone to rain on their parade? Who's someone to come along and go, no, we've decided it might upset a few people, so you're going to have to stop it. Sorry.
Don't forget that all veterans are racists. I can attest to this, being a veteran myself. Sure. Well, I do have another article, which is a bit more positive, called "The Enlightenment is Working," by a gentleman called Steven Pinker, if you've heard of him.
It does ring a bell, the name, yes.
He does, just a tad. Right, here we go. If I present to everyone. Right, here we are. Steven Pinker, being a resolute optimist when it comes to how things are going. He does a very good TED talk on this as well. But he's talking about the gloominess of, the media talking about, inequality, racism, pollution, terrorism, crime, moral decay, etc. Deepening crises in the West. And lots of people looking back and saying this is when America was great and that sort of thing. And when people found more meaning in their lives and so on. And anyway, so he goes through this idea that, we have, a whole broad range of statistics that prove that things are actually a lot better. And I've been pondering this for a little while, actually. I plan on releasing an edited video in more depth on it, called "We Live in Dangerous Times," which is quite a heady title, but it's something that I keep hearing consistently, from alt and regular media and politicians as well.
Effectively, the angle that you're always about to be butchered on the street.
Oh, yeah, or there's something like this thing desperately needs to change, or else.
Yes.
Because it's part of what generates the political impetus. Because people don't really advocate for the status quo. If the status quo is working, they don't really advocate for it because it's working. Whereas unless it directly affects them, it doesn't. So, and they're not really interested. And I think that's part of where a lot of political apathy comes from, particularly in the sort of the ranks of a lot of the working and middle classes in Britain. So you're talking about things like, but you get a lot of this stuff, particularly from the left, but also from the right, talking about things like what the murder rate was like, sort of 100 years ago, or so on and so forth, and what the murder rate is like now. And you go, well, the murder rate has fallen over time. In Britain, it's a little less clear because they changed the way the statistic was created. Yes. But broadly, up until about 5 years ago, or I think it was 2007 anyway, sorry, that's a bit further than 5 years, we knew that the murder rate was steadily dropping, and was relatively stable around this sort of a little.
Well, I think it goes back to they say there was a trend that seemed to be in operation after the Second World War, in which crime just incrementally kept going up.
Right.
And then it somehow, somewhere around the 1980s, it kind of peaked, and then it just started dropping. And
do you think that was part of the counterculture which arose sort of in the generation after the war?
They've kind of looked, academics have pored over this stuff, and some philosophy professors and whatever have even written, and I suspect this might go in this same direction, this article. They've written sort of tracts in which they're sort of saying maybe mankind is just becoming more civilized, and therefore it's been dropping, because nobody can quite explain these trends. But it is possible that at some point the trend that we are seeing bottoms out and it starts rising again. But it seems to be one of these things whereby the state doesn't really know the solution to it. It's just something something that's happened in society, and we're still not quite clear about what are the exact societal drivers.
Well, we're not. I mean, we're still dealing with the fallout from Nietzsche's Death of God, because we had the whole of the 20th century, which dealt with the fact that we had no values and we're trying to create our own, and we saw obviously the extremes rise up, and we become more moderate over time. But there's also things like, particularly, one of these stats here. So literacy, for instance. So in the 50s, only 35% of, or 36 worldwide were literate. And if you look at 2000s, you're looking at sort of 2014, 85%. And you just go, well, a greater level of education means a greater level of understanding for people. Okay. So it's less alien to people and that sort of thing.
And you just wonder when you say 85.3, you just wonder of those 14.7, how many of those people are in prison?
Yes,
that is one of the shocking markers. That what was it? There was those two Tories, one from the House of Lords, and an MP, wasn't it? That ended up in. I'm trying to remember what their names were. Geoffrey Archer was the one from the House of Lords, and there was a chap who I think had been a previous minister and whatever, and both of them ended up in prison. And the first thing both of them said when they came out was, "What are all those people doing in there?" And they were kind of the sort of hardline conservative, oh well, lock them up and throw away the key types. But when they had been in there themselves, the first thing that they said when they came out was, "Look, there's a great many people in there that don't belong in there." But it needed their going there to kind of open their eyes. But by the time they had been there, they were seen by anyone in politics as completely discredited, so we don't need to listen to them. So
Yeah.
it was strange that the two people who had had the experience and had suddenly had their eyes opened and said, we have a serious problem in our prisons. There are a great many people in here who are literally just in there because they can't read. And they were just dismissed by the political scene because, oh, well, they're criminals. What do they know?
You interjecting, Swiss?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's a great sort of catch-22 there that you picked up on, which is that in order for people to go and see it with their own eyes and acknowledge the problems there, the end process, by the time they got out of prison, as you said, completely discredited. No one's likely to listen to them. And I fear that's probably an ongoing situation. I imagine, anyone with a first-hand experience to be locked up behind bars and see what the conditions are actually like are not the people who are likely to be listened to.
Yes, unfortunately. And that side of things. Moving along as well, you've got this idea that democracy spreading has also contributed to the crime decrease. We now have over twice as many democracies as we did 20 years, 30.
And I think we will struggle to hold on to all of them.
I do.
Because I think the big battle that is coming up in the future with China throwing its weight about will be about the value of democracy. They will seek to make a counter-argument whereby they say, oh, well, you see, you can have a developed economy, you can have all these things without a democracy. You can have the communist state ruling over you and everything can work properly. And we will effectively face another battle a bit like the one we did in the Cold War. I'm not talking in terms of it being a Cold War.
No, more of
a challenge coming from another political model saying, we can do this better than you can.
That's an interesting point, because as I understand it, during the Cold War, one of the narratives was that, it pitting capitalism against communism, so to speak, that with capitalism came democracy. As markets were freed up, then democracy would flood in as well. But as we've just said, China's probably a prime example that, they've opened their country up to the markets increasingly, but we're not really seeing any equivalent in terms of the people having any more of a say over their lives.
Well, that was the big miscalculation that everybody made. That the Western politicians opened up towards China, basically promising all of us, oh, well, you see, once capitalism comes in, once the living standards of these people get raised, they will then start demanding greater liberties, and that will effectively topple the communist state. That was the explanation that we were all given.
It's amazing how much
happened.
It's amazing how much a cultural factor will influence that, because the Chinese culture,
yes,
is very different. And
entirely.
Assuming that you sort of have this tabula rasa culture thing from birth. I mean, I'm not saying that your culture is ingrained in you from birth, but the idea that people are distinct from their culture once they've been raised is ludicrous to me.
Well, when there was that famous tract, wasn't there, written by Francis Fukuyama, who became the darling of the neocons, and he was basically putting forward that liberal democracy is the peak of human development. This is the end of history. There will not be anything better coming along.
Yeah, we've got there. Give up, guys.
Yes, and he kind of embraced this entire idea that wherever liberal democracy is brought, people will embrace it. So, of course, Iraq then became his great showpiece. So, with the Western powers moving into Iraq, foremost the Americans, obviously the people were liberated from dictatorship, and they were given the chance to become a kind of Western-style capitalist democracy. So, with them being offered the chance, obviously they would take it. Except they didn't. They didn't want it. They were an entirely different culture. And that's where Francis Fukuyama, where his idea kind of fell into the dust, and he eventually had to admit, okay, I was wrong. Credit to him, he did eventually admit, okay, yes, I got it wrong. That there are other cultural markers that define people, and that if you're not brought up in the Western tradition, then you won't just embrace it when it comes along.
No.
And of course, we can see that played out before us with the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese have been a nation that, since ancient times, have been ruled by absolute autocracy. Their entire development as a civilization has effectively been under such rule.
Yes, they've always been either aggressors or aggressed, and they've sort of they've needed that kind of leadership. I mean, they had a very, it's bizarre. They had, you know, their equivalent to our feudal system with the whatchamacallit, the dynasties, etc.
Oh yes, the imperial dynasties, yes.
Yes. And that sort of thing, and baronies. And then they had their ongoing spat, shall we say, with Japan, which seems to have gone back and forth since time immemorial.
Yes, just a tad. It was a little misunderstanding between the two sides, wasn't it?
And tensions continue to this day.
Yes. And it was interesting. I had a talk from, so when I was in training for the RAF, we had the first Chinese delegates were allowed to take part in the training. Now, this was all a good faith sort of thing, and it was hailed as you know, the greatest act of cooperation and you know, a new era for military cooperation with China, and so on. Anyway, the group you're separated into teams when you're in training, called flights. And the flights who had these Chinese groups in them wrote a letter to their commanding officer saying, "These people are spies." At which point they were told off for being so culturally insensitive. Given, you know, they even brought the USB sticks that they'd been given as presents by the Chinese delegates and that sort of thing. Fortunately, the intelligence community was a little bit more woke and was following them the entire time.
Yeah.
And found out that they spent approximately 88% of their spare time at the Missile Defense Center, which was just down the road in the same county. At which point they were outed for having stolen some information or something, and they were sent home. At which point they immediately were discovered to be working at a missile development center.
Yep. Now there's a surprise
in the north. So you just go, oh dear. Like, but I was talking. I was listening to a talk by one of the people who come over. She's a researcher for a university out there, a little less connected to the government, and she was talking about when they talk about their country, they talk about it all in collective terms, particularly about we, the Chinese. There's never any sense of, you know, oh, the Chinese, or in the history, oh, we did this. No, but it's always about, as in, it's a very personal we, as in we did this. You know, when we had to realize in the late 20th century that we were no longer what we considered to be the most advanced place on Earth. And when we looked at things like the military side of things, we had to work out, you know, why navally dominant nations had ruled the Earth, and why, you know, us being a land army based nation, we hadn't, and that sort of thing. But they thought they'd talk about everything collectively. I mean, utterly everything, and it's very little individual autonomy there, you know, and that's ingrained in them, even down to the family unit. You know, this whole idea of, you know, family honor and that sort of thing, and the different roles that people play. It's very, very common, and so their culture is so different to ours as to be utterly alien. If you were trying to apply the same stuff to it.
I once heard someone say that in China, the state is essentially seen as being at the head of the family, you know, rather than the father at the head of the family or whatever. No, it's like it's the state. It's always there.
Doesn't it go back to Confucian thinking? That basically, you know, a lot of the underlying philosophy of Chinese life is about order and about let's make things work. And, you know, there are a lot of sort of Confucian pieces of advice where he basically says, look, if you are the little cog who works best in this place, then remember that you are the cog who is contributing to the working of the whole. So there does seem to be a great deal of sort of deference towards, authority, and in a way staying in your place, so to speak.
It seems to be sort of a million miles away from, in the West, we've got this notion of, individuality and individualism.
Yes,
and
yes, because our great philosopher was Socrates, and theirs is Confucius. And our great philosopher is the one who basically, whose famous maxim is, question everything. And in a way, he proves to be the diametric opposite of Confucius.
And one of the interesting things, though, I tend to find is it's quite indicative of Chinese culture and communist regimes in general, that they don't become, because of this sort of attitude, it depresses innovation somewhat. You still produce the same number of sort of genius level people, and so you will still get some innovation, but you don't get an attitude of innovation in the same way. And you get this idea that, so for instance, the Chinese, I can't remember what happened, an American jet got shot down and in some nation or another, in some war or another, and the nation in question sold all the parts that it could find to China. And the nation then said to America, we can't find the wreckage of your plane. And lo and behold, the designs of the next Chinese jet fighter came out, and they were very similar to a certain F-type aircraft. Anyway, so you tend to find that they tend to nab things from all the cultures around them.
It's interesting. There was I'm just trying to remember what their name is. There's a YouTube channel. And there's basically two chaps, and they travel around on motorbikes in China a lot.
Okay.
And they've got like microphones installed in their motorbike helmets, so very
so they can
often
talk whilst going.
Yeah, so they're driving around on these roads and they're talking, and they will talk about just about anything, certain aspects of Chinese life, what it means to live over there and whatever. Very often taken from the comments section, as in, you've asked us this.
Yeah,
what we've got to say about it.
Fake accents on the road, got it.
To a certain extent, they're they've kind of touched upon what things are like. Basically, they sort of said, look, anybody who speaks English or whatever will very quickly in China find themselves in a position where they're offered a job as a language teacher.
Yes.
So one of them's Dutch and whatever, so he speaks a bit of English, and he was sort of saying he was absolutely amazed at the attitude of pupils, because it's totally different. So he would give them some work to do, and they would hand in the work, and it was identical. Everybody had done the same work, and what they had done is they had found the best pupil, and he had done it, and then they copied it.
Yes.
They saw no wrong in that. And he was sort of saying, no, you don't seem to understand. I know you think what I want you to do is give me the best work possible. That is not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for your work. And even when he then managed to get them to give them their work, because they are so like-minded, it still all proved to be pretty much, monochrome. It was pretty much still the same thing. And the other chap sort of interjected at that point and said, you have to understand that there's an attitude among the Chinese that you copy the masters. So when it comes to things like calligraphy, you've seen that sort of those Chinese writing. You can see people sort of almost in a trance, kind of writing this stuff, very carefully. And what you're doing is you are copying a master. So you're looking how a master had written it, and then you try to emulate that. Only if you manage to emulate the master and become a master yourself, do you then begin to do your own thing.
I do recall my piano teacher from when I was young talking to me about She had some Asian students who had come across, or she'd done some teaching in Asia, etc. And she said that it was fine, it was fun, but they were incapable of inserting their own emotion into the music, because what they would do is you would play it for them, and then they would learn it and play it back to you in the exact same fashion in which you had played it to them, with whatever little mistakes that you may have made as well. But they would never, they would listen very attentively, and then they would attempt to play it exactly as you had played it.
Yeah, and this chap went even further. He sort of said, this copying, which to them is actually a virtue, this copying also shows itself in all the kind of knockoff brands and whatever in China. That they see it not as just copying anything. They won't just copy anything. They won't just take some brands' trainers and copy them. No, they will copy Nike and Adidas. Why? Because those are the masters. Those are the ones you do copy. So it's an honorable thing to copy those things. Yes. Because you're seeking to emulate that which is the best.
There's a similar story I heard from my brother, actually. He's been out teaching in China for the past year, teaching kids English. And he was, I think he was going through the phrases to sort of go, you know, I have a friend, my friend's name is John, my friend is tall, my friend has brown hair, whatever. And he said that a couple of the kids in the class, he instructed them all to write a few sentences to describe their friends. And out of a class of about 20 or 30, I'm not sure, at least 3 or 4 of them had basically just given a description of him. They'd just given a description of the teacher, and just they used the same examples he put up on the board and just went, and it's exactly the same as you've just described.
Well, I remember seeing a piece on the BBC once where they actually were interviewing, it wasn't called creativity, it was called something else, but I can't quite remember it, but he was something like a professor of creativity. And what he had to try and do is find ways in which China could become more innovative, because the Chinese themselves have realized by now that they've got a massive deficit in innovation compared to the West.
Yes, they are aware of this issue.
Yes, they've got this huge potential for output, but they realize that they're still only ever looking to what we do and then trying to replicate it. So they are aware of it. They just don't know themselves how to solve it, because they don't, it's not like a switch you can just flick. So it seems to be something deeply culturally ingrained. And he himself was sort of, this professor was sort of saying, from all the aspects and whatever that we've looked at it, we do realize that we have a problem. And it does seem to be cultural. But before I go on, because you mentioned that, those Chinese missile scientists, I also remember some other exchange once where some Western soldiers, sort of groups of soldiers, were sent to China. Basically, again, it was some sort of, working together in the spirit of friendship, blah, 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 blah. So they were doing some military training together. And these were the most simple things that they were doing. So they went orienteering, and all the Chinese got lost. So basically all the Western groups got there and were kind of competing with each other as to who would get there first. And the Chinese teams got lost. And it kind of indicated, it was almost as if the Chinese hosts were somewhat embarrassed, if you know what I mean. But because the international media, because a few camera teams had been invited, they then couldn't obviously confiscate the material they'd shot. But it did kind of indicate how badly trained some of the troops out there are, that they can't read maps properly. So they've got the equipment, they've got the boot polish and the boots, they've got the uniforms and whatever, but they're not necessarily that well trained. Because if you get lost on in an orienteering race, then you're more than likely not that brilliant. And I just found that amusing at the time to kind of watch that the British and the Americans, the French, were kind of competing with each other, and the Chinese, who were the hosts, were nowhere to be found.
Yes.
Because it turned out they couldn't read a map.
How interesting.
It goes back to what you were saying a moment ago, though, that it's hard to think your way out of a certain mindset if the lines along which you think are defined to some degree by language and culture. If that's what you've always, if it's what you've always known, if it's your very being of how you see the world, then you're right that there is no switch.
Well, I mean, think of it the other way around. If we would sort of realize, if we came to the realization that all our chaotic nature here in the West, all our creativity and chaotic nature was destructive, how would we stop ourselves from being like this and become more like the Chinese?
That's a very good question.
And in a way, that's what's being asked of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the example you give, to say to us, okay, all of our chaos, creativity, but along with that individualism, to then try to strip that away and say, okay, people in the West, you now need to think along different lines. Don't think of yourself as an individual. Think of yourself as a cog in a whole, in a larger whole. I don't think it's possible. At the very least, not for the generations of people already alive. It would have to be something you try
that is one of the reasons why I do not believe that China will rule the world. Because I think it is deeply hampered. It is hamstrung by this inability to innovate on a grand scale. They can innovate in so far as that they can throw numbers at a problem. So if you're looking for new medications and you just basically employ tens of thousands of chemists to kind of play around with vials, sooner or later you will find something, if you know what I mean. But the kind of great technological leaps will still more than likely continue coming from the West, because we are the anarchic ones. We are the ones where some genius will come along and think completely outside the box. We're in fact all encouraged to think outside the box.
We are, yes.
But I am always hearing about China developing high-tech industry and new supercomputers and the rest of it.
Well,
and there's this narrative that I hear of, there's this concern that China's outpacing us in certain areas, and I just wonder what your thoughts on that are, as opposed to this idea of being creatively constrained.
Well, China will be very, very good at assimilating and making the best of something that already exists.
Precisely.
So if there's a way to minimize something, the Americans will find out how to do it. But if there is a way to make a lot of things that have been developed work together in new and interesting ways, the Chinese will do it. It's sort of a...
They basically build on top of what's already there.
Yes. Yeah, basically, if you're looking for sort of incremental gains on existing technology, then why shouldn't they be able to do that just as well as anybody else? But if it comes to inventing an entirely new technology, that's the challenge. And that's where they realize that they've got a serious problem.
Indeed. And there we go. I've just invited So What on from the chat, who comes from China.
So we've now got Not So Obvious and So What. This is going to get confusing.
Just call me Mark, man.
So we'll end up with So Obvious and Not So What.
Not so what?
And a British and a Swiss as well.
What so obvious Swiss Britishman? Yes. That's
the British will end up with the British and the Swisser. Yes. Sorry, I'm completely killing this, aren't I? Yes.
I have no idea.
Keep plugging away. It will come back.
All I'm hearing is from the chat. One of the commenters is saying this is a bit sausage heavy and we need Sarah on because he wants to marry Sarah. Are you going to propose to her from the comments? Is that what your plan would be, Andy? Oh dear.
Well, I mean, if anyone's got the DM of Shoe on Head, we can always ask her to join us. But
can you imagine what a channel with 1 million subs would do for me? You imagine just instantly, I would overtake you, Britisher. That'd be hilarious.
But yes, I could see that happening. Yes.
After if people aren't aware, Britisher got a bit salty earlier on Count Dankula's feed because Count Dankula is basically has just clicked over 250,000 subscribers.
Just made 250,000. Yes.
Just made to 250,000, at which point Britisher fuming commented on, saying something along the lines of, what have I
think
got
it was
to do?
something like grinds teeth enviously and mutters something incoherent about Scotsmen of questionable parentage.
Yes. At which point, I naturally went and told him to make a video turning a dog into into William Wallace, and that would be that.
Brave Bark. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry for that.
No, I'm sorry. 10 points for that, definitely.
So where are you at as far as subscribers goes then, the Britisher?
I'm hovering somewhere in the 20,000 bracket.
Oh, that's still about 20 times the amount I have.
All right, so
you'll get there. Keep shaking that milk.
keep on plugging away.
Back to favourable statistics and that sort of thing, talking about how life has been getting easier and safer, certainly in every way. Over the past century, Americans have been 96% less likely to be killed in an auto accident, 90% less likely to be mown down on the sidewalk, nearly 100% less likely to die in a plane crash, 60% less likely to fall to your death, 92% less likely to die by fire and to drown or to be asphyxiated and 95% less likely to be killed on the job. That's the main thing for me, is like there's very little risk. When you talk about why, I believe one of the reasons why Labour is failing at the moment and why they're moving away from the working man is because the environment for working people is very much a safe one nowadays. And even if you do get injured on the job or whatever, when these nasty machines lops an arm off or something, you're likely to be very well compensated, which is something which Labour now can no longer capitalize on, attacking.
Of course, that so many of the dangerous jobs have disappeared. I mean, all the miners' jobs have gone.
Also very true. Or they've been automated. So I knew a miner, I mean, granted he had moved and worked in Australia, but he basically sat in a big machine all day and the machine did all the mining for him.
Mm-hmm.
So there we go. There you are, Andy. Sarah's turned up now. There you go.
When you were reading those statistics a moment ago, did I hear you say 100% down on plane crashes?
99% less.
Oh, 99
in a plane crash. Yes.
I was going to say, I thought I'd heard 100, and I thought, well, that was
zero then. MH17 is just missing. Like this.
Whenever I hear statistics of plane safety and whatever, I'm always reminded of the Superman movie. The original one with Christopher Reeve.
Oh yes.
Where Lois Lane is sort of hanging from the helicopter that is hanging from the side of the high-rise tower block on which it's supposed to have landed and crashed, and she loses her grip and falls.
Okay.
And then out of nowhere swoops, the Man of Steel and catches her.
Yes.
And just when she thinks she's safe, I think he says, "Oh, I've got you."
Yes.
And she looks at him completely confused and goes, "You've got me. Who's got you?" And the next thing, she looks up and she starts screaming. She was one of these scream queens. And the helicopter has lost, is no longer teetering and has begun to fall directly towards them.
Yes.
And of course, he only sort of holds up his arm and catches it as though it were nothing. So he gets to the top of the building, sets down the helicopter, sets down her, and says, "Oh, I do hope this hasn't put you off flying." You do realize it is, statistically speaking, still the safest form of transport.
That's amazing. I am always reminded of a monologue by Mick Flanders from Flanders and Swan, where he spends, I believe it's about 6 minutes, talking about how he's going to write a song on flying and then writes a song on the railways. But he starts it off by saying it's safer to fly now than it is to cross the road. And he says, of course, where I live, there are all these airline buses whizzing about, and I think they have instructions to keep the statistics favourable.
Beautifully put. I believe So What has arrived.
Good evening.
Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you briefly. I'll have to turn you up a little bit. But yes. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. It's good.
Oh, you can. Okay, that's great. Yes.
You've come across to us from China?
Not really. Not exactly. I've been in the UK for a long time, so.
It's good. You wanted to interject on the Chinese culture issue and that sort of thing.
Well, it's not really interject. It just want to agree with you. Really, that's exactly the description of Chinese. Sorry, this is my first time on the Hangout. I'm not sure what to do here.
No problem. No problem. Just feel free to chip in whenever you feel like it.
Indeed.
I'm a big fan of the British. Just want to throw that out.
Well, good to know. Yes, that's another one. or should my reply to that be so what?
Yes.
Good one. Good one. Yeah. Have you heard about some of those fake cities in China, where they build a whole fake city of a copy of a European city?
Oh yes. They've basically. I think some of those are pretty much ghost towns, aren't they? That they've pretty much built. They've built a sort of a town to look like a European one, but very many of those have very little uptake, and they're largely empty.
Yeah,
so they're seen as a destination where people will go and have their wedding photographs taken.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's the purpose of it.
I'd heard the same thing, that they're constructing these massive cities out of the ground in maybe the space of a year or two, but there's no one there at the moment. They're still waiting for people to move into all the towers.
This is just it. They have completely overbuilt, and they're continuing to build because their entire economic model is very heavily tilted towards construction, and they don't know how to kind of wean themselves off this. Because at the moment, I think they've got something like sufficient housing that is standing empty to house entire Germany, and they're still building.
And what's the end game with this then? I mean, you're saying their economy relies on it. When I'd heard about it at first, I thought, oh, that's planning for the future. All those cities they'll be moving.
No, it's a bubble. It's a bubble, and it will burst. And when it bursts, it's going to burst badly.
Well, there's not a practical use for all this construction then.
No, this is as bad as, or almost as bad as, North Korea building a fake city just north of the border, where it's basically a front and there's nothing really substantial there.
Is that the place with the biggest flagpole in the world?
Something like that, yes.
I think there is the biggest flagpole in the world there, isn't there? Because they need to be record breakers.
I know the North Koreans have these massive hotels they build, and they might only have 10 guests staying there at a time, and they won't even power some of the floors in the hotels unless they think
just as long as you don't remove one of the posters, as an American did.
Oh God, yeah.
What happened?
Well, he got arrested, and he got locked up for God knows how many years, and I think eventually he was dead.
Good grief. Well, I know that in North Korea you have what's called the rule of 3, which is where if you commit a crime, you will have 3 generations of punishment put upon you. So you will be there, your children will be there, and their children will be there.
So it literally will be the sons paying for the sins of the father.
Indeed, and it either eradicates the entire family, which does happen, or you get out the other side and they have no idea, but they're so terrified they never want it to happen again. But most of them, when they get out, have no idea why they're in there in the first place. It's just been their life.
Yeah, growing up in a labour camp because Grandad did something 50 years ago. Christ.
Well, not even because Grandad did something. It may just be that Grandad was misunderstood, or some error occurred.
Oh yeah, Grandad wasn't saluting the picture of the honourable leader sincerely enough.
It's amazing that they have the images of him are everywhere. I mean, like, it was something bizarre, but again, this sort of stems back into China as well, where you get things like Christianity is tolerated in China, but you have to have a portrait of the leader of on the wall above the cross.
So will that be Xi Jinping right now?
Yes, I believe so.
Or do you mean Mao?
I believe it's Xi Jinping, but there might be Mao.
Yeah.
So he has to be above the cross, to symbolically be above the church, and that sort of thing. But this sort of cultural dedication to one's leader, where it infests everything. Can you imagine having to have Theresa May above your mantle?
Well, I think if you wanted a revolution, I think the British are famously hard to rouse. But if you actually did want a revolution, where there would be a kind of poll tax style riot every day in every major city here in Britain, if you wanted that sort of edict would be the sort of thing which would cause it.
Yeah, I think, as I say, this is what leans me towards what I'm thinking about. Dominic says, "I've had enough nightmares, thanks." You might say you've had somewhat of a nightmare, Dominic. That's a running joke we have with him. But the basically,
I somewhat agree with you there.
You somewhat agree with me. Good to know that we are somewhat in sync.
Can I just suggest that underneath this Theresa May portrait, I'd like to say, rather than just a photograph, a nicely painted portrait, there's a little plaque that says "Strong and stable leadership in the national interest," and that is the mantra you must recite each morning.
Amazing.
Well, this is just it. Had she just done that, she would have won, and she would now have a majority over 100 in Parliament.
If she'd forced us all to have portraits above our mantle with that mantra.
If she went full Mal on us.
She absolutely blew it. Theresa May absolutely blew it at the last election.
Oh yes,
as long as she was doing strong and stable leadership in the interest of the nation, blah 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 blah. As long as she was doing that, she was way ahead in the polls. And everybody realized that Jeremy Corbyn was the least popular opposition leader in living memory. So he was.
Well, I don't know. The Miliband's are pretty bad.
Oh no, he was less popular than Miliband.
Okay.
And then what did she do? She got ahead of herself. She basically decided, right, I'm going to have a massive majority. I am the new Iron Lady. I am Margaret Thatcher. So now I'm going to tell these folks how it's going to be. So she then composed her manifesto all on her own with her two advisors.
Timothy and Fiona Hill.
Yes. So nobody in the cabinet was consulted, because this is now the way it's going to be. I am the new strong leader who's given you a majority of over 100. So this is the way the tune is going to be called. So here she was basically doing her victory lap before she'd won.
I do genuinely believe that a part of the reason why she lost quite so badly was a little bit of spite, because people could see her doing that. And some people, particularly those who are on the left but perhaps unlikely to vote, saw her doing that and saw that she had called the election at a time when she knew Corbyn was reformulating his party and was likely to be weak internally as well. And so they thought, well, that's a bit underhanded. I suppose I'd actually better go and throw my vote in the box.
Yeah, they spotted the hubris in her actions, I think. I think from day one when she called the election, because the expectation amongst basically everyone was that she was going to completely cakewalk it.
Well, yeah, it was
like you were saying. It's like you were saying earlier,
the manifesto.
But I think it's like you were saying earlier, the British like an underdog. And I think because May appeared to be on top for such a long time, in the final reaches of the campaign, people started going, and obviously demographically different between left and right, but people started going, oh, well, let's have a look at what Corbyn's got to say at least. Let's have a look at the manifesto, see what's in there.
Can I ask you guys about Theresa May? I'm a bit confused about Theresa May because in the UK, right, you've got all these feminists talking about how they want to break the glass ceiling or stuff like that. You've got Theresa May as the Home Secretary, as the Prime Minister, not to mention Margaret Thatcher.
Well,
you've got Amber Rudd at the Home Secretary, used to be. You've got the DUP leader, who is also a woman. You've got the leader of the Welsh Party, who is also a woman. You've got the leader of the SNP Party, who is also a woman.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Well, all of them have basically decided to embrace the virtue signaling. They all sort of think that it's a sign of how forward-thinking and progressive they are if they choose a woman leader.
My favourite phrase to coin has to be the progressive consensus. and that sort of thing. But it's it's funny as well, considering the sort of the track record that British politics has in terms of choosing the next successful prime minister. Can you imagine Prime Minister Rudd?
God, it just, you know,
that would be
moment,
tradition.
Yeah, at the moment, it appalls me, the sight of it, what we've got. I mean, Theresa May should have been fired when she was Home Secretary. She was useless as Home Secretary. And when she stood as a candidate for Prime Minister, they then had the audacity to actually say, oh, well, she's got such a great record as Home Secretary. And it was horrible. I mean, you know, how many times did you hear them saying that they wanted to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands?
Oh, it's been their policy for a decade, hadn't it?
Yes, and she was Home Secretary. And did it ever happen? No. And as towards the end of her tenure at the at the Home Office, as she then kind of was confronted more and more by the media about it, it suddenly became, oh, this is an aspiration. It's not a policy.
Oh yeah, that old chestnut. That's the favourite, isn't it? You set a target.
You remember the Olympics. In the run up to the Olympics, we suddenly had a huge problem at Heathrow, with people waiting 7-8 hours in order to go through passport control. And people immediately thought, oh, good God, we're going to have a meltdown here. We're only a few weeks before the Olympics, and we can't even handle the daily run-in Heathrow. What's going on? Well, what had the lady done? She had reduced the border force by 20%, and meanwhile she had insisted that they no longer use their discretion to decide whose passport to check. Now they had to check every single passport. So, you know, if you're a chap that works on the border force and you're one of these people checking these passports, you know whom to wave through. When the plane from Malaga lands and this kind of ginger-haired family arrive and the kids have still got their blow-up dolphins under their arm, you know full well these are not illegal immigrants. You know, you just wave them through. What's the point of checking their passports? But that was done away with. They no longer had discretion. They had to check every passport. So their workload went up something like by 100%, and their workforce went down by about 20%. And immediately you had calamity at the airport. And what did Theresa May say? This has absolutely nothing to do with me. This is an administrative problem that is caused by the leadership in the border force. And this is what I mean. It's out and out incompetence that this woman showed time and again. And then when she was then angling for the prime minister's job, her hanger-oners, so to speak, were on Newsnight and whatever, saying what a flawless record she had had at the Home Office and how she'd managed to hold on to this job for longer than anybody else. Well, yes, she had. But there was a very simple reason why she had held on to the Home Office for so long. Because she had been the person you couldn't fire. Because we've all heard the headlines time and time again when Cameron was Prime Minister. He was constantly coming under attack for not having enough women in the cabinet. Well, he couldn't, therefore, if he was constantly under attack for that very reason, then fire the one woman he had. So no matter how badly she screwed up, she always survived. Because she was the one person he couldn't afford to be seen firing.
You wonder about it. It's similar to Boris Johnson almost. He's so ridiculous.
Fire him, yes.
No, he's unsackable at this point, basically, because she can't risk firing him because the moment she
fires him, there will be a revolt. Yes. Yeah,
completely bizarre. Anyways, on that note, it is time to end. Unfortunately, that is all the time that I have this evening, but it's been a great pleasure to have you all on.
It has been an honor or a privilege, as usual.
As usual. Pleasure to see you, Britisher. Nice to see you again for the first time, Captain Switzerland, and for a short time, of course. So what? I apologize to the members of the chat who have just arrived, but there's the whole rest of the stream that you can catch up on. Fake Accents Unite should resume next Monday at 8 o'clock, and hopefully we shall have a longer one. Going now to Academic Agent's channel, he's going to have a talk on feminism with Daughter of Albion, Based Liz, and some other guests. So it's very good to get on that one if you aren't aware of it already. Until next time, take care.
Toodle pip.
Layers.
Thank you.